Gentil, welcome to our interview for the African Transitional Justice Research Network. We're so grateful to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. Before I start properly, I just wanted to ask you to tell us about yourself and what
Yes.
you've been working on recently.
Thank you very much again, Rutendo, for having me in this conversation. My name is Gentil Kasongo. I am a human rights researcher and a transitional justice practitioner from the D.R.C. I studied law in the D.R.C. and specialized in human rights law at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, where I received my master's degree in 2012. It's been almost 10 years now. Yeah.
It's a long time.
Over a bit over 10 years. Yeah. Yeah. So I currently work for Impunity Watch on transitional justice in the D.R.C., but I also have experience in the Great Lakes region. That includes Burundi, Rwanda. So Impunity Watch, in a nutshell, is an international NGO working with victims of crimes, grave crimes, and grave human rights violations. And we work with them to try to deliver redress for the violations they have suffered. We are also involved in promoting justice and peace in the context where we work, including the D.R.C., where my work focuses at the moment. So
Wow.
that's what I would say briefly.
You're definitely doing a lot. And especially since in that region, it's been quite a hectic year.
Yes, yes, indeed, yeah.
What are some of the observations that you've just witnessed in the last few months that you can touch on?
Some of the observations is that, for example, in the D.R.C. at the moment, there's a war going on, unfortunately, in the province of North Kivu, and continued violence in the province of Ituri. And at the same time, there is a transitional justice process that started, an official transitional justice process that started last year with popular consultations on transitional justice. The consultations are supposed to be held in 25 provinces of the country, but so far they have been held only in 8 provinces. But at the same time, there's one province, Kasai province, which also witnessed terrible violence in 2016 and 2017. In that province, the process is going quite well because they started before anything else started officially in the rest of the country. With support of the UN Human Rights Office in the country, human rights activists in the Kasai province, Central Kasai province, they initiated popular consultations on transitional justice over there. And the results of that process were used to put in place a provincial commission on truth and justice and reconciliation. So that commission already has members, the commissioners who started working recently. But for the rest of the country, because the country has 26 provinces, so for the rest of the provinces, 25, we're still waiting for the consultation process to finish, but unfortunately, it's not progressing well because of so many reasons. But in parallel, there's I think a trajectory of transitional justice in the D.R.C. that has benefited from political support at the highest level in the country, but also financial, legislative support at all levels. It's related to the reparations of victims of violence, sexual violence, but also other types of violence that has occurred in the country. So that process benefited from support from the First Lady of the country and her husband, of course, the president. And that led to the adoption of a law on reparations in the D.R.C. That law was enacted in December last year. And very quickly, they managed to put in place a reparations fund, a national reparations fund, based on that law on reparations. And the people who are in charge of managing that fund are already nominated. So it's already operational. So in terms of transitional justice in the country, there are so many things going on. And in the Kasai province, there is already a truth commission already operational, although not without difficulties. At the national level, there is already a law on reparations, a national reparations fund already put in place. At the same time, the pillars of transitional justice, including the justice aspects, the truth seeking at the national level, but also guarantees of non-recurrence and memory work are still waiting to be put in place. So those are the recent developments going on in the D.R.C at the moment. I don't know if I was clear. Yeah.
No, very, very clear. There's so much that I can actually take away from that. Like you said, that the process has got its challenges. And one of the questions that it still takes me to one of the questions, which is, what are the pressing challenges for transitional justice in the D.R.C, in the Great Lakes region, and in Africa generally at the moment?
Thanks, Rutendo. I think some of the biggest challenges that civil society actors and other stakeholders in the field of transitional justice and human rights in general are facing include lack of political will. I would say also entrenched interests, but also particularly in the context of the D.R.C, cycles of violence, and lack of knowledge about the field of transitional justice, but also human rights in general among authorities, but also among populations in general. So firstly, lack of political will makes it difficult to put in place and implement initiatives and mechanisms that are meaningful for victims and affected communities. That's what I realized in the context of the D.R.C, but also in the Great Lakes region, because at the moment there is a transitional justice process in Burundi, also in the D.R.C. So that challenge is real. Human rights activists, civil society actors can testify to that, because it's a reality we find on the ground. And secondly, entrenched interests of some powerful organizations and institutions. Lack of political will is a real problem in the region, and particularly in the D.R.C. In some aspects of processes, we see some kind of expressed political will. For example, in the reparation process that I mentioned in the D.R.C a while ago, we saw some kind of political will. The First Lady and the presidency of the D.R.C pushed for the process in terms of reparation measures can go forward. They pushed for a law to be adopted by Parliament, and it was enacted very quickly. But also they pushed for the reparations fund to be put in place, which is a positive thing. But the main critique is that it didn't follow the process as it should have, because we were supposed to have a national policy on transitional justice, and then as a foundation on which everything else will be built, either truth-seeking processes, justice processes, reparation processes. But we saw just one aspect of the processes being supported by the political elite in the country, but the other aspects were kind of neglected. So the political will is not really what we want to see in order to make the process go forward in a meaningful way. So I was also saying that interest of some powerful individuals, organizations, and institutions, either for economic reasons or political reasons, they also kind of nourish that lack of political will to make a meaningful change in the country, because some of those individuals are themselves suspects of violence that took place in the country and that continues to take place in some regions of the country. So having meaningful transitional justice processes would not be in their interest. So they try to interfere and trying to make sure that there's no political will, necessary political will to make things move forward in a meaningful way. So political will, like I said ago, is expressed in some aspects that benefit the political elite at the moment, because we are preparing national general elections, including presidential and legislative elections. So the issue of transitional justice is kind of being instrumentalized for political reasons. That's also an issue with regards to political will and interests. So like I said in beginning to answer this question, Cycles of violence not only perpetuate grave crimes and grave human rights violations, but also make it difficult to start some transitional justice mechanisms, which are supposed to take place in a post-conflict or post-violence context. So in the D.R.C, it's not a usual case for transitional justice because we are not really in a post-conflict context, because we have violence that is continuing in the east, especially mostly in the east part of the country. So some people say maybe the time is not right for transitional justice because we are not, in reality, we don't seem to be in a post-conflict context. So maybe we should wait. But on the other hand, other people view that something should be done in order to break the cycle of violence. Because in some of the transitional mechanisms can be, if there's political will, the necessary political will, some of the mechanisms and processes can help break the cycle of violence. Because impunity that seems to prevail is one of the causes of the perpetuation of violence, perpetuation of conflict, but also the fact that most of the root causes of conflicts and violence have not been addressed. That causes the conflict to perpetuate, to continue. So I think putting in place very meaningful transitional justice processes, particularly, for example, some mechanisms related to guarantees of non-recurrence, like institutional reform, demobilization, disarmament and reinsertion of combatants who are involved in armed groups, processes like vetting. Those are things that can be done, although the security situation is still quite terrible. But there are some mechanisms that can be put in place in order to help break the cycle of violence. It's an obstacle, it's really a challenge. The fact that violence continues because some activities can be done and some of the victims are not even in their homes because they fled conflict. They are in internally displaced persons camps or refugee camps. So it's a huge problem, the fact that there is a violence that is continuing. But at the same time, there are options in order, for example, to reach out to people who are in refugee camps, because that's one of the recommendations of, for example, the AU policy on transitional justice. It recommends to include processes, people who left, who fled their villages, their towns, their places because of violence, and reach out in refugee camps, for example, in order to include them in the processes. I also mentioned lack of knowledge about transition justice. Affected communities, but also among policymakers and decision makers. So that's a challenge because it affects the engagement and participation of affected communities in the process, because they don't understand what it's all about and how to go about it. So as a result, most measures put in place by policymakers and decision makers do not reflect the needs and priorities of victims and affected communities. There is a need for awareness raising activities, which we have already started doing in order to contribute to decreasing this lack of knowledge and to contribute to increasing knowledge about transitional justice and the rights of victims, the right to truth, the right to justice, the right to reparations, guarantees of non-recurrence. So there's a lot of work to do on that, but the fact that even among policymakers and decision makers, not only in the D.R.C. but also in the region, the knowledge about these processes is quite little. It's also a challenge, but that can be surmounted by work on raising awareness, sensitizing people about that, but also sharing knowledge about transitional justice and the rights related to those processes. So that's what I would say. I don't know if I was brief or quite long.
Actually, it's very, very good. You know, you touched on some of the questions I was going to ask, and you've opened up other places of conversation. For instance, for me, when you're talking about addressing the root causes and trying to break the cycle of violence, it shows me that there's an approach you're trying to take where you're trying to make the issue of justice and peace an everyday conversation. And I think that's highly important, instead of transitional justice being just this big event that you do and then everybody moves on, especially where there has been years of persistent violence in cycles as well.
Yes.
That said, it seems, especially in the 8 provinces, and I think we shouldn't downplay that, because even though there's 26 provinces, in the short amount of time that transitional justice process has taken place, those 8 are a big achievement. And I'd love to know, what are some of the successes that you're seeing in the conversations or even in the general patterns around violence in those 8 areas?
Yes, actually, the process, the regular consultations on transitional justice, they are with support of the UN Human Rights Office in the country. So they are the ones who have the data, and they have not been published widely yet because the process has not finished, actually. The process is being led by the National Ministry of Human Rights in the country, but with support from the UN Human Rights Office in the country. So you're right, indeed, having done the consultations in 8 provinces is already a huge achievement. And actually, they used the committee which was in charge of developing a national transitional justice policy for the D.R.C. actually used some data from those 8 provinces to inform their analysis of the context, but also in terms of the needs of the victims and their priorities. But the issue about that is that, yes, it's a progress, a significant achievement, but the context, the D.R.C. is quite huge, and the contexts are different. For example, the context in the Eastern D.R.C., provinces of North Kivu, South Kivu, and Ituri provinces, which are located in the east of the country. The context is mostly culturally, but also the way, the nature of conflicts that have occurred is different from, for example, what happened in the central of the country, in the Kasai region. It also different from what the context and the nature of the problem of the conflicts in Western D.R.C, for example, in the Maindombe province or the Congo Central province. So yes, violence occurred in all those contexts, all those provinces, but the causes and the nature of the violence is quite different. So the advantage of having information from all provinces would help take into account the specificities of context, because what people expressed as their priorities or needs in the Congo Central province near Kinshasa is not necessarily the same as what people in Eastern DRC, like 2,000 kilometers away, would express as their needs. Because in some contexts, it was just inter-community conflicts, ethnic conflicts. In other places, it was like a kind of religious conflict. In other contexts, it's none of that, but violence perpetrated by armed conflicts for some economic or geostrategic interest. So, the contexts are different, and some of the violence that occurred is different. So that's why it's very important that the consultations are well conducted and in all provinces in order to capture all the specificities in the different contexts. Because, as you know, in order for transitional justice processes to be effective and meaningful for the affected communities, they have to be context specific. So that's why I'm in the view that the people involved, especially those who have a decision on that, the government of the D.R.C, but also the other international actors who are accompanying the process, they should emphasize to have the process completed in all the provinces in order to have all and take into account the specificities of all the contexts in the national transitional justice policy, but also in other documents like laws that are going to be adopted and enacted in that process. So I agree that it's a huge advancement, it's a huge progress, but there is a lot to do in order to make sure that the needs, priorities, expectations of affected communities, which are mostly context specific, are reflected in the policies and the laws to be adopted and enacted. So yes, there's that need actually.
That's very interesting how you point out the very differences between the provinces. I think my question there is, when it's now a national framework and a national policy, there's an expectation that it's going to be this one big unified thing. So how do you overcome all these differences? People's needs, expectations, demands, they're all different. And How do you overcome them
Yes.
and then create these policies in a way that reflects the the diversity of needs for people?
Yes, it's a really a challenge, a tricky one, but it's possible. I think there is already a model and experience. I mentioned somewhere at the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned the fact that there is already a transitional justice process in one of the provinces, the Kasai Central province, which witnessed intercommunity violence, which was related to customary power. Unfortunately, it caused a lot of violence, a lot of suffering among communities in that area. But fortunately, the violence stopped. It didn't continue for a very long period of time. It took place in 2016 and 2017. And after that, there was like a kind of a post-conflict context, which allowed various actors, including the provincial government, the local civil society community, but also the international community represented by the UN mission in the D.R.C. They worked together to organize the first consultation, popular consultations on transitional justice, but at the provincial level, taking into account that specific context. And one of the recommendations of the consultations was that the government had to put in place a provincial commission, a provincial truth, justice, and reconciliation commission, which is already operational. That's one of the ways of contextualizing the processes and the approach, because it takes into account the specific context and the needs and expectations of the local population. So one of the ways actually is trying to replicate that model in other provinces, because we may have a national transitional justice policy which recommends, and which is actually the case because it's one of the options that that committee put in the draft, because at the moment we have a draft national policy on transitional justice which actually gives that possibility of having a decentralized process. Having, for example, although it's a national transitional justice policy, but it recommends, it foresees the possibility of having provincial commissions on transitional, on truth and reconciliation, for example, or provincial mechanisms related to justice processes, and so on and so on. So there's that possibility, and it will be actually the best way to take into account specific context.
That's very interesting. I never really thought about the idea of decentralizing transitional justice because it's always been a key part of the challenges I have mentally when I think about it. I'm like, okay, so these are countries in Africa. Some of them are very big geographic regions that have very different needs and very different realities. And how then do we overcome that? And I think that's actually a very, very helpful way to think about it. And now, actually, that you've mentioned the national sort of process that you're all working on, how helpful has the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, how helpful has it been to creating this decentralized national framework?
I think the national, the African Union Transitional Justice Policy has, I think, inspired to some extent the draft national policy that we currently have, because it has not been adopted yet. But when I read it, I can see that the authors of the policy, of the draft policy, consulted or read, took into account some of the recommendations of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, because they take into account, for example, some of the cross-cutting themes that are not normally addressed in transitional justice processes, but which have been included in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. For example, issues about gender, about youth, the inclusion of youth in processes, issues about refugees, the inclusion of refugees, internally displaced persons in the processes, and other marginalized categories of people. When I look at the draft national policy, I can see that they try to take into account some of the key recommendations of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, because I think the AU team leading the transitional justice policy at the AU Commission, they did some visits in the country, in the D.R.C. I think last year, and they had the discussions with various stakeholders involved in the process. So I think that was kind of helpful in helping them to draft a somehow or somewhat holistic policy that takes into account the various aspects of transitional justice. Because I see all the pillars of transitional justice are in there, but also, like I said, some of the cross-cutting issues are also taken into account. I would say that in that way, the African Union Transitional Justice Policy has influenced in a positive way the policy documents that are currently being developed in the D.R.C. What lacks at the moment is the inclusion of opinions and the views of populations, especially those living in most conflict-affected provinces, like the province of North Kivu, South Kivu, and Ituri in the east are the most affected by conflict so far. They are the province where consultations have not taken place yet. We hope that the consultations will be organized there as well, but so far not yet. And it's a very big issue because when we talk about transitional justice, the focus has to be on victims. And the vast majority of victims and affected communities in the D.R.C. are located in the east, in those particular provinces where the consultations have not been organized yet. So that's an issue because in order also for the processes to be successful, they have to benefit from a certain ownership by the affected communities.
Yes.
So that it's not only a national process or something for the government thing or civil society thing, but the population, the general population, particularly affected communities, should say this is our process. The transitional justice process going on is our process. In order for them to say that, they need to have their views understood. They need to have their views taken into account. They need to be consulted because we are in a sort of a design phase of an official transitional justice process in the country. So in order for the affected communities, for victims to own the process, they need to participate in a meaningful way in the design phase.
Yes.
Not only in the implementation phase where they see things coming from the national level, the highest level, top down, but they should also be involved in the design phase so that they can own the process, but also that can ensure that sustainability of the results of the process is guaranteed, because transitional justice processes are put in place just for a short period of time. But if the populations concerned have taken ownership of the process, that can guarantee the sustainability of the results, because they will say, okay, it's our process and we will continue. Even though the mandate of the commission can finish, they will say, okay, we will continue this process because it's our process. So that's what I wanted to to add. I don't know if it's I don't know if I was clear.
I'm coming out of this interview with just like so much pride for the continent, because I'm like, there's just so much people are working on and are trying to do and are really trying to take active steps and active measures to overcome these legacies of violence. And it's years and years of it that people are trying to undo in a short amount of time. So it's I'm I'm in a lot of awe right now. Seems like, these are very complicated processes, very challenging processes. And that just brings me to two of my last questions, which I'm going to compress together for time. What motivates you to do what you're doing, especially with how complicated this process that you just explained to me is? And where do you think, as the year is going on and in the next few years, where do you think transitional justice practitioners and anyone working in the justice space should be focusing on? So what motivates you, and where do you think we should be focusing on? What are the pressing concerns?
Thank you. I think what motivates me to do what I'm doing, I would say it's a passion for human rights and peace building, but also I think a sense of contributing to peace and justice in my country and my region. Because yes, I work for Impunity Watch. I'm a consultant on justice issues, human rights issues, peace building. But for me, in addition to being a job, it's also a passion for me because I feel like I'm contributing to peace and justice in my country, which is in dire need of that, and the region that has been torn by conflict for many years. So the fact that I'm contributing to change is what motivates me to keep doing this and do more. So I think, yeah, thanks. Yeah. I think some of the issues that we should be focusing on transitional justice in coming months, years. I think victim participation is crucial, and also the promotion of informal transitional justice processes, because victim participation is crucial for the effectiveness of transitional justice processes. Because, like I said, transitional justice is first of all about victims' rights, and victims know best what is needed to achieve justice and prevent violence from recurring. So they are the experts. So they should get involved and they should participate in a meaningful way. But also the promotion of informal transitional justice processes, because informal transitional justice processes complement formal or official processes. And sometimes when official or formal processes are deficient or absent, for example, in the D.R.C, the informal processes are the only recourse that affected communities have. The advantages of informal transitional justice processes for communities affected by conflict and violence, particularly in the D.R.C context, they include the use of local languages, because the fact that those informal processes, which are grounded in communities, in customs, and they use local languages, it makes it easier and accessible for affected communities, but also geographical proximity, because access to justice and some official processes is very difficult because of distances. In the context of the D.R.C, which is very huge, some communities don't have access to some of the government processes and facilities and institutions. But also cultural relevance of the traditional mechanisms is also very important. Also the low cost, because informal processes are not expensive like formal ones, where people have to travel and pay expenses, pay this or that. So those are, I think, victim participation in processes should be promoted in a very effective way, but also the informal transitional justice processes that benefit a lot to affected communities living in villages, in very remote places. The promotion of that also would be important in terms of complementarity with official, formal mechanisms, but also in some contexts, it's the only way affected communities have to find some redress because of lack of political will at the national level and other obstacles. So those are two areas that I would mention as important to focus on and promote now and in the future, for transitional justice to be very effective and meaningful for victims who are the first beneficiaries of the processes.
No, definitely. I mean, thank you so much, Gentil. I've learned so much from this process, and I really like how you're emphasizing the importance of the informal transitional justice processes, because even just the conflict itself, the way that it occurs is at a community level, and these community residents are the ones who know each other. They're the ones who know what they need more than anybody else who's coming in from outside. So it's been a big learning experience for me, actually. So I really, really enjoyed this interview.
I'm happy to hear that, Rutendo, and thank you very much for having me in this conversation.
No, thank you for making the time. I understand how busy you are, so I'm really, really grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rutendo, and speak to you soon.
Yeah, speak soon, Gentil. Have a lovely weekend. I hope you get some rest. Merci beaucoup. Merci, merci.
Merci beaucoup. Have a lovely weekend too.
You
And
too.
a lovely evening. Bye bye.
Bye bye.